My name is Ossie Morris. I was a director of photography in the film industry. I started as an unpaid gopher, as we say, getting tea and buns for the crew. I then became a clapper boy and for several years then became a camera assistant for a few years, a camera operator for even more years, and then finally I became a lighting cameraman or director of photography in 1949, right through to the time when I retired. And I photographed some 58 feature films.
Was working with Guy Green and David Lean a great training ground for you learning to light?
Oh, it's the most perfect training ground. I mean, I couldn't have had two better tutors. I mean, Guy was a marvellous cameraman. He won an Academy Award for his beautiful black and white photography of Great Expectations. And I joined him for Oliver Twist and Blanche Fury, which was in colour, and Passionate Friends. And I learned a tremendous amount from Guy, and I used his type of photography as a model to start off myself, and I often compare some of his efforts with my first efforts, and although mine are a very poor imitation, you can see the connection between my style and his style. So he was I was very fortunate in having Guy to help me. David Lean, of course, is a perfectionist, and it was a marvellous training for me as well, because with David, the camera I operated on for Guy on David Lean's films, 2 films for David Lean, Oliver Twist and Passionate Friends, and you just have to get everything right with David. There are no ifs or buts. It's got to be perfect. Camera movement's got to be absolutely spot on. Dollies, tracks smooth and steady, and the camera flows with the actors. He won't have anything that doesn't flow with actor movement, and compositions have to be right, headrooms, no face in the middle of the picture, they have to be offset slightly to one side, and all those sort of things. So what with David directing and Guy lighting, I really had 2 wonderful tutors. Even before I met and operated for Guy, before the war, I operated for Ronnie Neame. Ronnie was a cameraman who in those days was determined to get a very simple style of lighting in fashion. Before Ronnie started, black and white lighting was very complicated. Many lights from different directions, many shadows all over the place. And Ronnie felt that was a waste of time. It was very time consuming, and that the best way to handle it was to have a single key light and soft filler light, and he was determined to try and develop this principle, and he did so very successfully. The war came and Ronnie and I separated. He stayed in filmmaking and I had to go into the war, and Guy Green came onto the scene and worked with Ronnie, operated for Ronnie, and then he got a break on his own, and he developed a technique of single key light and soft fill light, which Ronnie had developed, and that's how I came then to work. I came out of the forces and started to work with Guy again, because I'd missed out several years because of the war, and I developed eventually the same technique. So Ronnie really started it, went through to Guy Green and then on through me, and it's a simple single key light, soft fill light technique. The first film was Golden Salamander, which Ronnie directed. When I got the chance to photograph this film, I thought I must do something to make it not look like a first effort of a new, very inexperienced cameraman. I've got to give it some style or some twist to make it look a bit different, even if it's still not very good, so that people will remember it. And the story took place in Tunisia in North Africa, and so I spoke to Ronnie and I said I'd like to give it a sort of a French influence in the photographic look. In those days, the French cameramen all continental cameramen lit with fairly high contrast with very heavy diffusion on the camera, the Germans particularly, but the French did it quite a bit. So I said to Ronnie, I would like to do that with overcorrected skies. The Mexicans do that as well. Overcorrected skies, quite contrasted, but with soft diffusion. And he said, yes, by all means, go ahead. Now, I tried to do that. Now, looking back on it now, having retired and all these films later, although there are an awful lot of mistakes in it, at least it's got a style of its own. It doesn't, to me, look like a first effort of a cameraman. It may not be very well photographed, but it doesn't look as though it's that bad and that it was me struggling. I think I got away with it, but it was only because I decided to develop this technique and try and give the film a sort of a different look. So I think it worked. Oh, choosing one's own crew is very, very important. You must have total loyalty from your crew. You must never suspect that they're doing things that I wouldn't approve of. They've got to be able to work on their own while I'm doing something. I'm lighting. They've got to be setting the camera up, laying tracks, and working out the setup with the director. And I've got to know or feel all the time that they're doing what I would want them to do. So I would never make a film without choosing my own crew. On a couple of occasions, the director has said, would I like to photograph a film for him? And I said yes. I've read the script and I said yes. And he said, no, I'd like to use my own operator. Do you mind? And I've immediately said, yes, I do mind. If you want your own operator, I don't want to do the film. I've got to have my own person. And he's understood that, and I've got my own way, but I couldn't do it any other way. They must be totally loyal to me, otherwise I think the system falls down. I wasn't the first choice for photographing Moulin Rouge. Another cameraman, a German cameraman who's since sadly died, was the first choice. But in the preliminary stages, something went wrong with the chemistry between him and the director, John Huston. And I was approached and asked if I'd like to go and see the great man, which I did, and I saw him, and I thought the interview went very badly. But anyway, to cut a long story short, I was offered the film, and the other cameramen didn't continue. When I saw Huston, he said to me, look, the only advice I want to give you is that I'd like the film to look as though it was photographed by Toulouse-Lautrec. Now, the film, as you know, is a story of Toulouse-Lautrec's life, and he wanted it to look as though Lautrec himself had directed the film. So Huston sent me down to the museum at Albi to look at all the Lautrec paintings to get some ideas, and I came back with a definite pattern of what I thought the film should look like. And we assembled little bits of the sets, and I did some tests of these on these sets, and I found that the best way I could copy the Lautrec paintings, as it were, was to put a lot of smoke into the set. And so I put a lot of smoke into the set, colored the smoke, and I also put diffusion on the Technicolor camera. And Huston and I thought we were getting some pretty good results. Well, this didn't please the Technicolor people at all, and there was great hostility to what we were doing. They felt that we were degrading their image. We were counter to what they were in the business for. That was to create crisp, sharp, clear line in a color system, that the colors should be strong and powerful because that's what the audiences liked, and we were diffusing them and softening them, and they were very unhappy with what we were doing. So much so that they sent Huston and I letters saying they could not accept any responsibility for what we were doing. Anyway, this was very demoralizing for me, but Huston backed me up and said, listen, kid, I think what we're doing is right, and we're going to go on doing it. to hell with what they say. And so we went on and we made the film that way. Every day we used to fill the studio with smoke. Had to be very hot. It was very hard to keep the smoke level constant. We coloured the smoke with all the colours from the Lautrec paintings. And I thought it looked, very good, and I was very pleased with it. And at the end of the film, when it was all completed and shown, we had letters from Technicolor. The same people that had written the ones saying they would have nothing to do with us, we had letters saying what a marvellous job we made of the film and how thrilled they were to be connected with such a great breakthrough in colour. It obviously was opening new avenues in colour, and they were from the people that had decried us right at the beginning and told us that they couldn't accept any responsibility. It was a complete turnaround on their attitude, and it really was a bit farcical, a bit of a joke. The Technicolor system was designed by a man called Dr. Kalmus. Dr. Kalmus had problems with his wife, as far as I can gather, and they didn't hit it off very well, so he sent her to England as colour consultant for Technicolor in England. And she had great power. She could come on the set and alter all the colours of the set. Otherwise, because it was a franchise, you franchise the Technicolor system, but they retained all the cameras and all the copyright. So they had a lot of power. They could withdraw their cameras if they didn't like what was happening. So she had a lot of power, and she would come on the set. And I well remember her wearing these ghastly hats, rather like this man Shilling designs for these ladies at Ascot, these ridiculous hats, such things. She'd have fruit on the top of them in the most ghastly colours and flowers and most horrible colours, which Houston and I used to wince every time we saw them, and I thought it was indicative of her rather poor taste. And she would come on the set and try and throw a weight around and say, you must change these curtains, they aren't right, and this settee is the wrong colour, we can't have that, that must be changed. But she got short shrift from us, and she tried it on at the beginning, but when she saw that we were determined to do it our way, she never came near us in the end. But I thought it was indicative of the poor taste that the Technicolor people had for colour in those days, that the hat was typical of their thinking, which appalled me, it really did. As far as I'm concerned, no. I mean, if they hire me because I assume they know what I've done and what I can do, and all I can do is give them my version of what I feel they want. I don't particularly adapt to any particular director. I adapt the photography to the story, but not to the director. I don't find any material difference between the American directors I've worked with and the English. Some are better with the technical side than others. Some directors are wonderful with actors, but they don't know where to put the camera, in which case I can help them. Some directors know exactly where they want the camera to go and are very good with actors. And so I don't have to help them then, because the director knows where he wants to put the camera. But that's about the only difference, really. There isn't much other difference between them. What usually happens, and we do this merely to save time, the director, myself and the operator get together, and the director tells us what he wants, say. That means to say I know what part of the set's got to be lit. I know that the operator, because he's my choice, will set the camera up the way the director and I have agreed. He will go on setting up the camera while I'm lighting the set, and that saves time. I'm absolutely confident that what he's doing is what I would want him to do, and while he's doing that I'm lighting the set, so that we are reducing the time element by quite a bit. So I don't, it doesn't bother me that he goes on doing it, because I know he's going to do it the way I want it, really. The American system, the the director gives the instructions to the, I must get this right, director gives the instructions to the cameraman and the gaffer. The cameraman then spends a lot of time getting the set up, because the operator is a much less important role in the American system than it is here. And the gaffer goes on roughing in the set. And then the cameraman just has a look at what the gaffer's done and makes 1 or 2 minor alterations, and he's ready. But he spent most of his time getting the camera set up. Now that's the American system. I don't work that way. I work the way I've just described. That's basically the difference between the two systems. Again, Houston said to me, I really would like this to look almost like an etching, if we can do it, with hardly any colour in it at all, but outline more than colour. And yet we've got to make it in colour. I don't want it to look exactly like black and white. I sent a stillman down to New Haven to do a whole series of stills to see, based on ideas I had and he had, to see what he could come up with. Well, he came up with some interesting ideas in trying to get an outline, a black and white outline, round everybody, rather like an etching, really. And we gave this to Technicolor and asked them to try, but to do the same. Well, they spent a lot of time trying to get it right. But because the negative was so small, 35mm, and we were working on 5:4 negative on the stills, it just proved impossible. The grain broke down. We couldn't get a line round it at all. It broke down into, and there was a lot of bleeding came through in the system. So we had to think of new ideas. In the meantime, the film was due to start, and I simply hadn't got to come up with a system. I went to the laboratory about 2 or 3 days after we'd started the film to look at some work. And when I went into the theatre, they were running a print of Richard III, Larry Olivier's Richard III, which was in very soft pastel colours. And I picked on this. I said, well, that's interesting. What's that for? They said, well, that's a television print for Richard III. In those days, television had to have very low contrast prints. They looked horrible on the screen, but then in the transmission, they came out looking fine. And they said, that's for the television company. And I thought to myself, well, that's interesting. That's diffused the colour, softened the colour. But of course, it also softened all the tones. It looked very washy. So then I thought, well, if we added a black and white to that, that would improve the contrast again, but it wouldn't increase the colour. So I asked them if they did that with a piece of film from Moby Dick, could they add a black and white image as well, or grey image as you might call it. And they said, oh yes, they could do that. I said, would they do me a test? Because we got masses of film there that they were working on. And they did a test, and it looked very interesting, I must say. I felt very thrilled about this. I thought we really got the answer. And I went and showed Houston this, and he said, yes, that's it, you know, we've got it. Let's go on doing that. And that's, in fact, what we did. We desaturated the colour, and we added a black and white, overlaid the black and white on the colour print. And the whole picture was processed and, well, was printed that way. It wasn't shot that way. We shot it normally, then the labs did the work. And that's why, you know, cooperation with the labs is so important. I went to Los Angeles with the show copy, and we were running it in a small theatre just to make sure everything was all right. And I noticed in the scene with the gulls over the whale, every time the gulls flipped across the screen, there was a little black gull following behind. And I thought, well, that's extraordinary. When everything was stationary, there wasn't the black gull. Then when the gulls would fly again, the black gull would follow. And I thought, well, that's strange. Something odd's gone wrong here. And I was in a terrible panic, because this was something like Friday, as we were due to show this film to the Warner Brothers people on the Monday. So I rang Technicolor in London. It wasn't easy to get through on the telephone in those days, and said, look, there's most extraordinary things happening. Something's gone wrong with this reel. Anyway, they got a copy there. They ran it very quickly, and they quickly diagnosed what was wrong. But in overlaying the black and white, they were about 3 frames out of sync with the color, which didn't show unless there was any violent movement. And any violent movement meant the black and white image was that much behind the color, and the gulls were flying around quite quickly, and that's how their black and white image got separated from the color. Didn't notice if the gulls were stationary because they caught up. An extraordinary thing. Anyway, they did another print very quickly and got it over in time, and we were able to show it to the Warner Brothers people on the Monday. Well, I believe that photography is more enjoyable if you can do it by eye. I think that's what it's all about. So all I do is whenever I light a set in the studio, for example, I measure one light, one key light, to make sure I've got the right level to start off with, and then I light everything by eye from that one light. I don't put a meter on everything because I think it's boring and dull, and I don't think it's a good way of doing it. It's much more interesting to do it by eye. On location, I really do the same thing. If it's a day exterior, I choose a spot where I know I want the normal exposure, and I go and read that. And if whatever that is, then I let everything else go, because I know I've keyed it in to a particular area that I know I want to be a normal exposure, and then I let all the other go. I don't go around with a meter reading everything. It's much more interesting that way, I think, to do it that way.
Do you usually sit on the timings of your answer prints?
Oh yes, that's very important. I mean, if you spend all your time, say 12, 14 weeks trying to get it right, and that's only the preliminary part. The important part is what the audience are going to see, which is the release print. So I do take a lot of time and trouble in getting that right. Normally what happens is that the labs produce one mute print themselves, which is rather uneven. And I go and see that. I allow for the unevenness, which they can iron out in the next timing. But I would just want to make sure they've got the basic density right and the basic colour right, because I like prints to be biased slightly on the warm side, and I want to make sure they're warm enough for what I like. And the labs like me to go and see to make sure, for their own benefit, that they're on the right lines. And then they will probably do a second print, and by that time they'll have got the sound track, because for the first print the sound isn't ready, they're still doing the dub. So they will put the sound on the second print, and I'll go and look at that, and that will be usually very close to being perfect. Now, they won't junk that print, they'll junk the first mute print, but they won't the second print. They'll stick that in with the thousands of release prints they're going to do, but they'll make one third print which should be absolutely right, and then they'll make all their 1,000 prints, whatever it is, from that one print. They'll make the necessary dupe negatives and run off all their release prints. So it's very important to keep in with the laboratory. When Norman Jewison came out to Yugoslavia before shooting started, he made it quite plain that he likes to go on holiday for about a week to charge his batteries before he starts the film. And he said, look, while I'm away, would you do some tests and see if you can give me some ideas as to how you'd like the picture to look? I said, yes, I would do that. So I noticed that as we wandered around the countryside, the earthy colour of the soil there was simply ingrained into everything that there was to be seen. The peasants, their skin tone, their dresses, their shoes, the houses, the curtain materials, all had this sort of browny, earthy hue to it. And I thought, well, now that's interesting, because if we could do that on the screen, that would might be something that makes something very interesting. So I looked through the various accessory equipment that we got, and they don't make nets or filters in anything but blacks or whites. You can have a black net or a white net, and all the filters are glass. And there was nothing brown. And I thought, well, if we could only get a brown net, that would probably do it. So one of my assistants said to me, you know, why don't you try a lady's silk stocking? That might work. And so I thought, what a good idea. Well, we got some stockings and tested them, and we eventually found a net that was rich brown colour. I can't remember the technical name of the lady's stocking that produced this effect, but we bought those, and I did some tests, and it seemed to work beautifully. And I did masses of tests with these, and when Norman Jewison came back from his holiday, he looked at it all and was delighted with what he saw, and that's the technique we used for the whole film. It was all shot with a lady's net stocking on it. Yes, well, those are what we call magic hour, mystic hour shots. You have to shoot them at a given time just as the sun's going down, and they're a little bit tricky to work out. So what we normally do it 3 times. We do it once when we know it is a bit too bright, and then we do it a second time. That's a safety thing. We do it a second time when we think it's the right time. And then we do it a third time when we think, well, it's probably too dark, but if it were to be all right, it would look marvellous. So we try and get either side of what we think is the right one, for safety's sake. Now, all one can do there is to shoot with the lens wide open, and to get something on the negative has to be fully exposed. Otherwise it looks grey and flat. Now the full exposure would be the flame of the candles, and I got some special Technicolor 3-wick candles sent out from England. They've got 3 wicks in them, so they give a slightly brighter flame. They're made specially for film work, and I got the procession to carry those along. We were fortunate in having a good sunset, and we had several cameras on it. But the problem is, you've only got about 20 minutes when you can do this. Now, a big wedding procession, you wouldn't get 3 shots at the procession in one night. I think we got something like 2 goes at it on the first night, and so we had to do it again the second night, and I hoped and prayed that we'd have the same conditions. Luckily we did out there, so we set it all up again the second night, and so we got the first night, say we got 1 too light and 1 normal, and the second night we got 1 normal and 1 too dark. So we got there 3 bites of the apple, as it were, and I can't remember which one was used in the picture now. It's probably the middle one. I think the dark one was too dark, and the light one was too light. We had playback out there. Isaac Stern had already recorded it, and Tutti Lemkow, who played the part of the fiddler, was up on the roof trying to mime to the recording, and he wasn't very good for a while, and we were doing this at dawn in the morning, and Tutti was having a certain amount of trouble, and I was getting frantic because it was getting lighter and lighter, and he still couldn't get it right. And I thought, gosh, we're going to blow it if we're not very careful. I'm going to have to come out here early the next morning. In point of fact, what we did do, we worked all night and then stayed on and did the dawn shot the following morning, and I thought we're going to have to do the same thing the next day, but he finally got it right. And in fact, the scene that's in the picture is the one we got on the first go. But there were moments when I thought Tutti wasn't going to be able to synchronize his bow movement on his violin with Isaac Stern's soundtrack recording. The recording was definitely done first. Well, there are 2 points to answer in that question. Firstly, the Technicolor level was 800-foot candles of daylight light for a stop of T 1.2 or 3. Now, that meant it was all arc light. If you used incandescent light, you had to put blue filters on, and that cut it down so much that it was almost pointless to use any incandescent light at all. It was all arc light. And that was terribly difficult to get any form of modelling or style to the lighting at that level. It really was quite difficult. At the beginning, I found it very hard. It took a while to get into that way of thinking. That's the first point. Second point, has the film helped the improvement in stock? Well, of course it's helped, yes. I mean, nowadays, with relatively little light, you can get more beautiful results than we could ever get in the early days. Certainly better than the Technicolor 3-strip garish colours. Modern colours are so beautiful now, and the stock is so beautifully balanced and such fine grain that it's much easier. And I mean, you can go out now with fast film and fast lenses on a night location almost without any lights at all, except maybe a little hand basher just to fill in the foreground to get a very good exposure. Well, you couldn't do that in my day. You had to go and light streets up, we had to wet them down, we had to put arcs on buildings, all sorts of things like that. It was a horrendous job, but now it's so much easier. I don't think it worried me too much that I couldn't go. The reason I couldn't go, of course, was because I was working on another film and they weren't prepared to release me for the 3 or 4 days necessary to go and collect it. I think the honour was in getting the award, and even though I was woken up at about 2:30 in the morning to be told that I'd won it, it was the least of my problems. I think winning the award was everything, it meant everything to me. I have since been to one of the ceremonies. They're wonderful ceremonies to go to. I mean, they wine you and dine you like you've never been wined and dined before. On the last one I went to, I was nominated, but I didn't win, but I enjoyed myself immensely. So no, it didn't worry me. That it would have been nice to have actually gone up onto the stage and collected it oneself, but I couldn't do that. So director Norman Jewison collected it for me and brought it back, and they had a little ceremony on the set at Pinewood Studios while I was making Sleuth, the film that prevented me from going. I can't actually remember the year I was invited to become a member. You have to be invited by the society to become a member. You can't apply. They have to invite you to become a member. It was before Moulin Rouge, so it must have been as a result of one of my early black and white films. I think the qualification was that to be considered, you had to have photographed at least 3 feature films, and I'd done Golden Salamander, and I did another film after that called Cairo Road, and another film I think called Circle of Danger. And I think after those 3 I was invited to join, and I know that I was a member by the time I made Moulin Rouge, which was about my 6th or 7th film, because I got the BSC award for Best Colour Film for Moulin Rouge. I was approached by Jim Henson's right-hand man in this country, one Duncan Kenworthy, and was asked if I'd like to go and see he and Jim with a view to photographing a big puppet film they were going to do called Dark Crystal. I went and saw them and they talked about it, and I said, yes, I'd like to do the film very much indeed. They said there is one snag, that in order for us to get the money to do Dark Crystal, we have to do a Muppet film ahead of that. And the part of the deal would be to do the Muppet film as well. Would I do the 2 films? So I talked it over with Lee, my wife, and I thought, well, I've never done a Muppet film, why not have a go? So that's how I came to do the 2 films. I found them the most enterprising and one of the cleverest groups of people I've ever worked with. I mean, what goes into these puppet characters is quite remarkable. The electronics and the thought and the care and the attention to detail. I remember Jim Henson saying to me, look, when we were doing the Muppet film, Ossie, the only advice I can give you is that I want you to consider Kermit to be my leading man and Miss Piggy to be my leading lady, and would you photograph them as you would, say, Cary Grant and Carole Lombard or Joan Crawford. And I did that. I put diffusion on Miss Piggy whenever I photographed her, and I was very careful with the way I lit Kermit, because they were Jim's leading characters, and that's his sort of thinking, and it's a very dedicated and very sincere way of making a movie, and it has to be admired. And we did some wonderful things in it, mixing puppets, a puppet which is only, say, 2 feet tall, and another one that maybe is 3 feet, with human beings in full-scale dancing and things like that, was quite a problem, and more for the operator than for me. But it was a great challenge, and I'm very thrilled I did it. And then from then we went on to dig Dark Crystal, which was, of course, puppetry on a much, much bigger scale. Huge figures with sometimes 2 people inside them working them. Well, the light flex, I use the light flex to take the reality out of the visual picture. I used a colour wash in the light flex. Some people use it to enhance exposure, but I used it to put an overall splash of colour. And I find that when you do that, I did it on a previous film I did called The Wiz, when you do that, it takes the stark reality out of the thing and makes it a bit more like fantasy, which is, after all, what Dark Crystal was about. It was a fantasy story of impossible characters, really, and it took the reality out of it by putting a wash over the image with the light flex, which I did. I varied the colours in each scene depending on the basic colours in that scene. I sort of supplemented the colours in the scene with a light flex colour. Well, I feel that every film I do has to be a challenge. It has to be fresh. It has to be new. It has to be something that stimulates me. And I thought that, nobody came up with any ideas for photographing a film that I hadn't already tried. And I began to feel that if I'm just doing them just for the sake of doing them, it's no longer fun or magic for me. And I was terrified of going downhill. I thought that several of my contemporaries have done that, and they've got work only because producers are very sorry for them, and they've said, oh, give Charlie Jones a job because, he hasn't worked for a little while and he did such wonderful work so many years ago. I didn't want to be in that situation. I wanted to stop where I was, because I thought I got as far up the tree as I was ever able to go. So I decided to cut it off there and call it a day, which in fact I did do. For example, in this village, if we've been out of an evening and I come home and there's a moon, full moon, I look at the pattern that the moon forms on the ground. I look at the sky, either way as I'm walking along. The sky under the moon is always lighter than the landscape, so the landscape's silhouetted, and the sky, the other end, opposite end, is dark and there's no silhouette. And we try and do that in the studio. I also look at paintings. I look at lighting everywhere I go. If I'm on the underground, I'll look at lighting. If I'm on an escalator, I'll look at lighting in hotels. I look at lighting to get ideas. So it's absolutely true. I just keep my eyes open, same as you mentioned in your question.